Hello, this is Marcos Patchett, the Nocturnal Herbalist, and today's video, relatively short one, 10 minutes or so, is going to be just a few thoughts of mine on astrology, scientific testing and prediction. And this is just prompted by a couple of things that came up in the last couple of weeks on my social medias. One was a comment on this channel and the other was a comment I saw on my private Facebook account made by another astrologer, and it really got me thinking. So I just wanted to share a few thoughts on these issues, and obviously this is with my hat as a traditional astrologer rather than my hat as a practicing medical herbalist, wearing the metaphorical hat anyway. Alright, so the comment on my channel was this comment on the video I did about the medieval astrology of COVID-19, which should be linked up here. And this was a comment by Jake Edwards. I'm just going to read it. He says, "So the scientific studies are not valid, ? Denial of evidence doesn't mean it is so. Please explain what points of which studies you think are not valid. Is it to do with double-blind testing or anything along that nature? I'm interested to see how an astrologer rationalizes evidence that is contrary to their belief system." So I'm just going to read my reply because I replied at length to Jake's comment there. I said, "Hi Jake, thank you for your question. It's a good one. I don't want to deny evidence. I think extant studies are useful in showing the limits of astrology and what it isn't." And what I mean by that is essentially a lot of the astrological studies testing astrologers' predictive powers in controlled situations or particular statistics show that astrology isn't particularly reliable in these sort of artificial setups or when used as a sort of statistical predictive device. So that's useful for establishing limits. You can't use it in a context-free manner, which I'll explain in a moment. But there are multiple issues with the assumptions behind the research, which I will go into in a future video. My biggest objection, and something I'd like to see and plan to set up if I can get any other astrologer interested, is a longitudinal study of astrological prediction in practice, set to run over 20 or 30 years with subjective, how useful it was, and objective, did it happen, how accurate was the prediction, data. So this is the thing that's missing. We don't have any scientific testing of in real life astrological prediction over many years, over many astrologers. So actually how astrology is used for prediction in practice has not been tested. Any of the so-called tests of astrology's ability to predict things have been using these very artificial setups, particularly the matching tests, where astrologers are given a little psychological profile and told to match, say, one of 3 different charts to that profile. And there have been numerous criticisms of this. I'll link not Carlson. I can never remember this brilliant astrologer's done a website which I will link below. I always forget his name when I'm doing these videos, but I'll put it on the screen, this guy's name and his website. It's a great website listing astrological research, and the limiting factors with these matching tests, there are several. The biggest one I'm going to talk about in a moment, to my mind, but there are technical issues, particularly the issue of the actual criteria themselves for producing these mini biographies. They're often based on psychological tests, and in independent studies where people have had to match these little psychological biographies to the actual people, the people performed very poorly because these little mini bios themselves were poorly representative and descriptive of the people. So how the hell the astrologers could have any chance of doing it with the charts, I don't know. So there's a definite limiting factor in the test design there. But there's a bigger issue, which I'll go on to in a minute, and that's why I'm a strong advocate for we need a longitudinal, as in a long-term survey, collating data from real astrologers doing real predictions for real people over many years before we even attempt to come to a conclusion about whether or not astrology can be useful in practice as a predictive device. Anyway, So many difficulties to be surmounted in how the data is gathered to avoid cherry picking, because obviously if you ask astrologers to submit all of their consultation details in a particular way, then the danger is people might consciously or unconsciously select all the times they were right and leave out all the ones that, anyway, you get the idea. But this sort of long-term real-life trial is the only way to test any divinatory technique. And this is my big objection. The idea of setting up a lab test, such as Carlson's now infamous matching tests, is a good one on paper, but probably not useful for testing any divinatory technique. If, as we must assume for astrology to have any chance at working, the universe is conscious, so the as above, so below hermetic axiom can be true, then any test with prefabricated limiting or artificial conditions may not work. It's not like you can step outside the machine and pull the levers. We're in it, we're inside the machine. As you pull the levers, your own levers get pulled. Questions of divination are fundamentally consciousness dependent. So what I'm talking about here is the fact that when you are attempting to test any form of divination, you are essentially asking the universe if it's conscious. So even though astrology might look as if it's mechanistic, it isn't, because it's a symbolic language. So the symbols are only ever interpreted in the light of the context of the thing. So this, I don't want to get onto a philosophical tangent here, because there are many different ways of looking at it. The issue here is that if the universe is conscious, if we live in a physicalist, materialist universe where, as I like to say, it's the mind after matter universe, the universe where at first, as Terry Pratchett put it, at first there was nothing, which exploded, and then all that stuff arranged itself and eventually produced organisms which could think because they have the thinking apparatus, and then that's where we're at now. In that kind of universe, then for astrology, first of all, it'd be very unlikely that astrology could work in that kind of universe, and secondly, if it did, it would have to be on some kind of mechanistic basis, even though we don't understand the mechanism, arguably. So even if the mechanism was quantum or something, it would have to be there'd have to be some mechanism, and therefore it should be statistically testable. Given that the statistical tests don't work, at least show a very poor results on the whole for astrology. Yes, I know there are exceptions. I know about the Galqualand data. I know there are astrologers who've amassed data which contradicts that narrative. But on the whole, the preponderance of evidence is that statistical prediction using astrology in isolation of context, it doesn't work in that mechanistic way. But we see as individuals doing astrology that it can work remarkably well for prediction. Not all the time, not 100% of the time, but often enough for it to have been in use for 3,000 years, unless you believe, as many scientists obviously do, that it's people's delusion. And scientists often quote Occam's razor, you know, the idea that the simplest explanation is probably the correct one, to say, well, it can't be anything esoteric like you're suggesting. But I have two problems with Occam's razor. The first is that I often say glibly, rhetorically, with sharp razors you can cut off bits you will later miss. There's no reason why the simplest explanation should always be the correct one, because very often in real life explanations are complex. But the second issue, and perhaps more important one, is that very often people using that as a means of dismissing evidence or testimony, particularly subjective or anecdotal testimony, very often people using that will assume a mechanistic universe, will assume that physicalism is the answer. Well, actually, in consciousness studies, we know that there are many other possibilities. There's idealism, where we could be living in a giant freaking hologram. There is panpsychism, where essentially matter and consciousness are one thing. Consciousness is inherent in all matter, and matter is always striving to arrange itself into conscious units. But the point is, and there are lots of different models, but the point is, in all of these other models, the universe, if the universe is conscious, then doing a test, setting up a test with a certain intention in mind, or with a certain mindset, you will actually affect the outcome if you're testing something like divination, which is fundamentally dependent on the action of consciousness. That's what I'm saying. So anyway, it's as I've said, so any trial of astrology has to be run in real life. The statistical work done so far shows that it doesn't work, has no mechanistic predictive power, arguable, but generally speaking, which should be a great relief to anyone who doesn't want to live in an automatic universe. Yet prediction demonstrably does work in practice, not 100%, not reliably, but it happens often enough to be useful. I think the problem is the illusion of objectivity. If we strive to generate that, the conditions created may preclude prediction, which is what I've just said. So long-term, in real life study required. So those are some of my thoughts on astrological prediction and scientific testing. I'm going to record a second video. I've gone a bit over time, but not too much. I'm going to do a second short video on a separate issue, which is, should astrology even be used for prediction anyway, and can it predict? So anyway, these were some preliminary thoughts on the scientific method. There is a lot more to say. I'm going to link, I've remembered his name, Robert Curry's website. I'm going to link Robert Curry's website below so that you can have a look at some of the extant scientific studies in favour of astrology, because all of the mainstream platforms like Wikipedia and whatnot only cite those sources which weigh in against it. So anyway, I hope this was interesting, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Bye.